I Want Sex. The Black American Soldier, Threat to Japanese Women Which She Never Saw Coming. August 23, 1945, Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ruins of what had once been Shizuko Tanaka's village. The 22-year-old woman sat among 37 other civilians in the back of an American military truck, her hands trembling despite the humid air. 3 days had passed since the American soldiers arrived, 3 days since everything she knew had ended. The propaganda posters she had seen throughout the war flashed through her mind. Americans were devils. Black Americans were worse. They would torture prisoners. They would violate women. They would show no mercy. Her mother had warned her before fleeing to the mountains. If the Americans come, die with honor. Never let them take you alive. But Shizuko had not died. When the soldiers found her hiding in the collapsed remains of her family's home, she had frozen. A young American soldier, his face covered in dust and sweat, had extended his hand. She had taken it. Now she sat in this truck, wondering if death would have been kinder. The journey to the coast took 6 hours. The prisoners spoke in whispers, sharing rumors and fears. Some said the Americans were shipping them to work camps in California. Others claimed they would be executed at sea to avoid the cost of imprisonment. Shizuko said nothing. She watched the countryside roll past, memorizing the green hills and rice paddies, certain she would never see Japan again. At Naha Harbor, they were loaded onto a Liberty ship. The same vessels that had carried American supplies across the Pacific now carried Japanese prisoners in the opposite direction. Shizuko descended into the hold with the other women, separated from the men. The space was cramped but clean. Steel bunks lined the walls. Electric lights blazed overhead, brighter than anything in her village even before the war. An American sailor, his skin dark as night, distributed blankets and canteens of water. Shizuko pressed herself against the bulkhead, avoiding his gaze. She had never seen a black person before the surrender. Now one stood 3 feet away, speaking words she could not understand. He smiled and gestured to the blanket. She took it without meeting his eyes. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now, back to the story. The crossing lasted 19 days. The women were fed twice daily: rice, vegetables, canned meat, and white bread, quantities that exceeded what Shizuko's family had received in monthly rations during the final year of war. The other prisoners whispered about American abundance, the casual waste they had heard about, the wealth that could afford to feed enemies better than Japan fed its own people. Shizuko ate mechanically, tasting nothing. She knew what awaited them in America. The propaganda films had been clear: prison camps filled with torture and degradation. She had seen the drawings of savage American soldiers, their faces twisted with cruelty. She had read the testimonies of what they did to Japanese women. Every night, she lay awake in her bunk, listening to the engines throb through the hull, carrying her toward a fate she could not imagine surviving. On September 10, 1945, the ship entered San Francisco Bay. Through the porthole, Shizuko glimpsed the Golden Gate Bridge spanning the water like something from a dream. The city beyond sprawled across hills, untouched by bombs, glowing with electric lights even in daylight. America had not suffered. America had won. And now, Shizuko belonged to the victors. September 11, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The train had carried them inland for 3 days, passing through landscapes Shizuko had never imagined. Endless farmland, cities larger than Tokyo, highways packed with automobiles. The other prisoners pressed their faces to the windows, silent with shock at the abundance surrounding them. When the train finally stopped, military police lined the platform. Most were white, but Shizuko counted at least 12 black soldiers among them. They stood at attention, rifles slung over their shoulders, faces impassive. One caught her staring and nodded. She looked away, her heart hammering. The camp sprawled across hundreds of acres of Wisconsin forest. Wooden barracks painted olive drab stood in precise rows. Guard towers marked the perimeter, but the wire fencing seemed almost decorative compared to the fortifications she had expected. Shizuko had imagined something medieval, stone walls and iron bars. This looked more like a military base than a prison. A white officer addressed them in careful Japanese. His accent was terrible, but his meaning was clear. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. They would work, but not in war industries. They would receive adequate food, shelter, and medical care. Any mistreatment should be reported immediately. The prisoners exchanged glances. Was this another American trick? Kindness before cruelty? The women were assigned to Barracks 17. Inside, Shizuko found rows of metal frame beds with mattresses. Actual mattresses, filled with cotton batting rather than straw. Each bed had 2 wool blankets, a pillow, and a footlocker for personal belongings. Electric lights hung from the ceiling. A coal stove sat in the center for winter heating. The latrine attached to the barracks had flush toilets and hot showers. An older woman named Fumiko, who had worked as an English teacher before the war, translated the signs posted on the walls. Meal times, work assignments, rules and regulations. The rules seemed reasonable. No fighting, no escape attempts. Obey all orders from camp personnel. Violators would face disciplinary action, but the punishment details were vague. That evening, they filed into the mess hall for their first meal. The building could seat 300 people at long wooden tables. The kitchen staff, all American soldiers, served food from behind steam tables. Shizuko took a tray and moved down the line. A black soldier ladled beef stew onto her plate. Another added mashed potatoes. A third gave her green beans, bread, butter, and coffee. She sat with the other new arrivals, staring at her tray. The portions were enormous. The beef stew contained actual chunks of meat, not the thin broth they had called stew in Japan. The mashed potatoes were smooth and rich with butter. The bread was soft white bread, not the sawdust-mixed loaves of wartime Japan. She ate slowly, waiting for her stomach to rebel against such richness. Around them, other prisoners ate with the resigned efficiency of people accustomed to camp life. Most were men, Japanese Americans who had refused to fight for the United States and been declared enemy aliens. Some were civilians like herself, captured on Pacific Islands. A few were military prisoners, still wearing tattered remnants of Imperial Army uniforms. After dinner, a black sergeant addressed the new arrivals. Fumiko translated his words. Tomorrow they would receive work assignments. Women would work in the laundry, the mess hall, or the camp hospital. Men would work on maintenance crews or in the furniture workshop. Everyone would work 6 days per week, 8 hours per day. Sundays were for rest and personal time. They would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, usable at the canteen. Shizuko lay in her bunk that night, unable to sleep. The barracks were warm. Her stomach was full. The mattress was comfortable. Everything contradicted what she had been taught to expect. Where was the torture? Where was the cruelty? Where were the devils the propaganda had promised? September 14th, 1945, 10:30 at night. Shizuko had been assigned to the mess hall, washing dishes and cleaning tables after meals. The work was exhausting but straightforward. The American soldiers who supervised them were businesslike but not cruel. They corrected mistakes without shouting. They demonstrated tasks rather than simply barking orders. It confused her more than brutality would have. On her third night, she stayed late to finish cleaning the serving line. The other prisoners had returned to the barracks. Only one soldier remained, a black sergeant named Henry Johnson. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet 2 inches, with broad shoulders and hands scarred from manual labor. He supervised the evening cleanup crew and usually left immediately after inspection. Tonight, he lingered. Shizuko worked quickly, wanting to finish before he approached. She could feel his eyes on her as she scrubbed the steam tables. Her hands shook, making the work sloppy. She had to restart twice. Finally, she heard his boots on the concrete floor, coming closer. He stood 3 feet away when she turned. His face was hard, unreadable. He looked at her the way men looked at women when they wanted something specific. She had seen that look before, though never directed at her. Her father had warned her brothers to protect their sisters from such men. Now she stood alone, with no protection. Johnson spoke in English. She understood nothing except his tone, which carried no kindness. He repeated himself, slower this time, as if volume would bridge the language gap. She shook her head, trying to step back. He moved closer. Then he said 3 words she understood. 3 words that had been taught to every Japanese girl as a warning about American soldiers. 3 words in English that she recognized immediately. I want sex. The directness of it shocked her more than crude suggestion would have. This was not a question, not a request, a statement of fact, a demand. He stood between her and the door. His size made resistance pointless. She had heard stories about what American soldiers did to Japanese women in Okinawa. She had dismissed them as propaganda. Now she faced the reality. Shizuko's training took over. She bowed deeply, the gesture of absolute submission. She made herself small, non-threatening. She waited for him to take what he wanted, praying he would at least let her live afterward. Her mind went blank, a defensive numbness that women throughout history had learned when facing inevitable violation. Johnson watched her bow. Something flickered across his face, too quick for her to interpret. Then he laughed, a short, harsh sound without humor. He said something else in English, his voice dripping with contempt. He turned and walked away, his boots echoing through the empty mess hall. The door slammed behind him. Shizuko remained bowed for a full minute, not believing he had left. When she finally straightened, her legs nearly gave out. She stumbled to the wall and slid down, sitting on the cold concrete. Her whole body shook. Tears came without sound, years of held emotion breaking through her carefully maintained control. She did not know whether to feel relief or terror. He had not touched her, but he had made his interest clear. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Tomorrow he would return, the day after. Eventually his patience would end. She was his prisoner. He was her guard. No one would stop him. When she finally returned to the barracks, Fumiko saw her face and asked what happened. Shizuko could not form words. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the other women breathe in sleep. Everything the propaganda had warned about was true. The Americans were beasts. The black soldiers were predators. She had been a fool to think kindness meant safety. September 15th through September 20th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and confusion. Shizuko worked her shifts in the mess hall, hyper-aware of every soldier who entered. She catalogued their faces, their movements, their patterns. Sergeant Johnson appeared twice, daily, during morning and evening inspection. He never spoke to her again. He barely looked at her, but his presence hung over her like a blade waiting to fall. The other soldiers confused her more than Johnson did. They treated the prisoners with casual decency that seemed incomprehensible given the war that had just ended. A white corporal named Miller learned to say good morning in Japanese and greeted her daily with a butchered but sincere attempt at politeness. A Hispanic private named Rodriguez showed her how to operate the industrial dishwasher safely after she nearly burned herself on the steam vent. Most surprisingly, several black soldiers treated her with what appeared to be genuine kindness. Private Thompson slipped her an extra bread roll when she missed breakfast after a sleepless night. Corporal Adams, the camp medic, checked her hands when he noticed the chemical burns from the harsh cleaning solutions. He gave her thick rubber gloves and demonstrated their proper use with patient gestures. These small mercies made Johnson's threat more terrifying. If the other soldiers could be kind, his cruelty had been deliberate. He had chosen to frighten her. He had wanted her to know her vulnerability. The kindness of his fellow soldiers would not protect her. Military hierarchy meant they would not question him. She was nothing. He had power. Fumiko noticed her distress and pulled her aside during a break on the fourth day. The older woman spoke quietly, mindful of the guards nearby. She asked direct questions in rapid Japanese. Had someone hurt her? Had someone threatened her? Shizuko hesitated, then told her everything. The words tumbled out faster than she could control them. Fumiko's face hardened. She had been in the camp for 2 months already, transferred from a facility in California. She knew the system. She explained the official channels for reporting abuse. There was a designated officer who handled prisoner complaints. There were procedures, documentation, investigations. The Americans took the Geneva Convention seriously. They feared international condemnation. But Fumiko also explained the reality beneath the procedures. Reporting Johnson meant accusing a decorated combat veteran, a sergeant who had survived 3 years of fighting in Europe. It meant being questioned by male officers who might not believe a Japanese woman over an American soldier. It meant publicity that could make life worse rather than better. Some women had tried. Few succeeded. Most lived with the consequences of failed accusations. Shizuko listened and felt hope die. She thanked Fumiko and returned to work. That evening, she scrubbed serving trays with mechanical efficiency, her mind elsewhere. She had survived the war in Okinawa. She had survived the journey to America. Now she faced a different kind of survival, measured in small victories and careful avoidance. On her 6th night, Private Thompson appeared during cleanup with a basket of apples from the camp canteen. He distributed them to the work crew, including Shizuko. She accepted the fruit with a bow, confused by the gesture. The apples were enormous, red and perfect, unlike anything she had seen in Japan even before rationing began. Thompson smiled and said something in English. She did not understand the words, but his tone carried no threat. He simply wanted to share food. The innocence of it made her want to cry. Here was a black soldier, the enemy she had been taught to fear above all others, giving her an apple with genuine kindness. While Sergeant Johnson, another black soldier, had threatened her with violation. How could both truths exist simultaneously? That night, Shizuko lay awake trying to reconcile the contradictions. The propaganda had painted all Americans as monsters. Experience showed some were kind and some were cruel, just like Japanese soldiers, just like all humans. But understanding this intellectually did not ease her fear. Johnson's threat remained real, regardless of Thompson's kindness. September 21st through September 25th, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The autumn air grew colder, bringing frost to the morning grass. Shizuko had been in the camp for 2 weeks. The routine had become familiar. Wake at 6, breakfast at 6:30, work from 7 until noon. Lunch, work from 1 until 6. Dinner, free time until lights out at 10. The predictability should have been comforting. Instead, it left her tense, waiting for the pattern to break. Sergeant Johnson maintained his distance. He conducted inspections without acknowledging her existence. She should have felt relief. Instead, his silence felt like a drawn bowstring, tension building toward inevitable release. She watched him interact with other soldiers, noting his easy laughter with the men, his professional demeanor with the white officers. Only with her did he show nothing. The absence felt more threatening than hostility. On her 10th day in the mess hall, Corporal Adams appeared during the morning shift. He asked Fumiko to translate. He needed someone to help in the camp hospital. One of the Japanese nurses had fallen ill. The work would be lighter than the mess hall, better hours, and provided medical training that might prove useful after release. Was anyone interested? Fumiko translated the question to the work crew. Most women shook their heads. Working in the hospital meant closer contact with American soldiers, many of them sick or injured. It meant touching them, caring for them, seeing them vulnerable. The idea repelled women who had spent years viewing Americans as demons to be destroyed. Shizuko hesitated. Hospital work meant leaving the mess hall. It meant escaping Johnson's daily presence. But it also meant working directly with Corporal Adams, another black soldier. Could she trust him? His kindness with the gloves had seemed genuine. But so had Thompson's apple, and kindness did not guarantee safety. Adams waited patiently while Fumiko explained the duties: changing bandages, distributing medications, taking temperatures, cleaning equipment, basic nursing tasks under direct supervision. The hospital operated 24 hours, but her shift would be 8 to 4, 6 days per week, Sundays off. 80 cents per day, same as mess hall work. Shizuko stepped forward before fear could stop her. She bowed and said yes in English, one of the few words she had learned. Adams smiled, relief evident on his face. He gestured for her to follow. Fumiko squeezed her hand as she left. "Be careful," the older woman whispered in Japanese. "Trust slowly." The camp hospital occupied 2 connected barracks, converted into examination rooms, a small surgery, and a 20-bed ward. The smell of disinfectant overwhelmed Shizuko when she entered. Adams led her to a supply room and demonstrated basic tasks: folding bandages, sterilizing instruments, organizing medications. He worked slowly, making sure she understood each step before moving to the next. His patience surprised her. American efficiency usually meant speed. Adams took his time, checking her work, correcting mistakes gently. When she burned herself on the sterilizer, he treated the injury with the same care he would give a soldier. He did not rush. He did not scold. He simply helped. Over the next 4 days, Shizuko learned the hospital routine. Most patients were American soldiers treating minor injuries or illnesses. A few were Japanese prisoners, isolated in a separate section for tuberculosis screening. She worked alongside Adams and a white nurse named Lieutenant Morrison, a stern woman who tolerated no mistakes, but taught effectively when teaching was needed. The work exhausted her, but differently than the mess hall. This fatigue came from concentration rather than physical labor. She had to remember procedures, recognize medications, understand basic anatomy. Adams quizzed her daily, his questions simple but thorough. He seemed genuinely invested in her learning. On the 5th day, Private Thompson appeared for treatment. He had cut his hand during maintenance work, a deep gash requiring stitches. Adams numbed the wound and let Shizuko assist, holding instruments and cleaning blood. Thompson recognized her and smiled despite the pain. He said something that made Adams laugh. The corporal translated through gestures. Thompson was telling him about the apples, how she had bowed so formally for simple fruit. Shizuko felt herself smile, the expression foreign after weeks of fear. These men joked with each other like brothers. They treated her not as an enemy, but as a person learning a new skill. The normalcy of it shocked her. How could they be so casual with someone whose country had killed their friends? How could she feel safe with soldiers who had destroyed her homeland? That evening, walking back to her barracks, Shizuko saw Sergeant Johnson across the compound. He stood with a group of soldiers, smoking cigarettes and talking. He glanced her way briefly, his face unreadable. Then he turned back to his conversation, dismissing her presence entirely. The casual indifference hurt more than threats would have. She realized she had become invisible to him, not worth even the energy of intimidation. Somehow, that felt worse than everything before. September 26th through October 2nd, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The hospital became Shizuko's refuge and her classroom. Each morning she arrived at 8, donned a white apron over her civilian clothes, and entered a world governed by procedure rather than fear. Corporal Adams proved to be a patient teacher. He demonstrated each task 3 times before asking her to attempt it. When she made mistakes, he simply showed her again. The work brought her into contact with wounded soldiers returning from the Pacific, men with malaria, men with infected wounds from jungle combat, men carrying injuries that would never fully heal. Adams assigned her to the recovery ward, where patients needed basic care rather than complex medical intervention. She changed bandages. She brought water and food. She emptied bedpans without complaint, grateful for work that kept her hands busy and her mind occupied. The soldiers treated her with cautious politeness. Most had fought against Japan. Some had lost friends to Japanese bullets or bayonets. Yet they said thank you when she brought medication. They smiled when she struggled with English words. A young private named Williams, recovering from shrapnel wounds, began teaching her basic phrases. Good morning. How are you? Please. Thank you. You're welcome. Private Thompson visited the hospital frequently. His hand wound healed cleanly under Adams' care, but he continued appearing with minor complaints. A headache, a twisted ankle, a suspicious cough that disappeared when Adams examined him. On the 3rd unnecessary visit, Adams finally laughed and told him to stop wasting medical resources. Thompson grinned sheepishly and admitted he just wanted to check on Shizuko's progress. The admission confused her. Why would an American soldier care about a Japanese prisoner's well-being? Thompson explained through gestures and simple English that Adams translated. He had a younger sister back in Georgia. Seeing Shizuko afraid reminded him of how his sister looked when their father drank. He wanted her to know that not all men meant harm. Some men just wanted to help. Shizuko listened and felt something crack inside her carefully constructed walls. This black soldier from Georgia compared her to his sister. He saw her fear and wanted to ease it. The propaganda had never mentioned this possibility. that enemies might recognize each other's humanity, that kindness could exist between people who had every reason to hate. But Sergeant Johnson remained a shadow over everything. She saw him occasionally across the compound. He never approached the hospital. He never acknowledged her existence. His indifference should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like a storm gathering strength, the calm before destruction. On October 1st, a Japanese prisoner was brought to the hospital with a broken arm. He had fallen from a truck during a work detail. Adams set the bone, while the man bit down on leather to keep from screaming. Shizuko assisted, holding instruments and cleaning blood. The prisoner's eyes met hers with desperate gratitude. Finally, a face that looked like home. His name was Takeshi. He had been captured on Iwo Jima after the Marines overran his position. He spoke rapidly in Japanese, grateful to use his own language. He asked about her village, her family, her journey to America. She answered carefully, aware that Adams listened even though he could not understand the words. Takeshi lowered his voice and told her what the men said in the barracks. The black soldiers were dangerous. They took what they wanted. Several women had disappeared from camps in California, transferred suddenly with no explanation. The prisoners whispered about assaults that went unreported because complaining meant worse punishment. Takeshi warned her to be careful, to never be alone with them, to remember that kindness was often a trap. Shizuko walked back to her barracks that evening with Takeshi's warnings echoing in her mind. Was Thompson's kindness genuine or strategic? Was Adams teaching her skills or gaining her trust for darker purposes? Was Johnson's distance a respite or simply patient hunting? She no longer knew what to believe. October 3rd through October 9th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The changing leaves painted the camp in shades of red and gold. Shizuko had been in America for 4 weeks. The routine had become familiar enough that she no longer jumped at sudden sounds or flinched when soldiers approached. But Takeshi's warnings had reignited her paranoia. She watched every interaction through suspicious eyes. Corporal Adams noticed her withdrawal. During a quiet afternoon in the hospital, he asked through gestures if something was wrong. She shook her head and continued folding bandages. He did not press, but his concern was evident. That evening, he brought Fumiko to the hospital to translate. He wanted Shizuko to know that if anyone mistreated her, she could report it. The camp had procedures. The Americans took prisoner welfare seriously. Fumiko translated carefully, watching Shizuko's face. When she finished, Adams added something that made Fumiko pause before translating. He said that he understood why Japanese prisoners feared black soldiers. He had heard the propaganda, seen the drawings that portrayed them as savage. But he wanted her to know that most black soldiers joined the military to prove they deserved equal treatment in America. They fought for a country that did not fully accept them. They understood what it meant to be seen as less than human. The confession shocked Shizuko. She had never considered that American soldiers might face their own struggles with dignity and acceptance. The propaganda had portrayed America as unified in its decadence. The reality was more complex. These black soldiers fought for a nation that segregated them from white troops. They wore the same uniform, but ate in separate mess halls. They bled the same blood, but received different treatment. On October 6th, Shizuko witnessed an incident that crystallized this complexity. A white officer entered the hospital and demanded immediate treatment for a minor cut. Adams was treating a black soldier with a serious infection. The officer insisted his injury took priority. Adams quietly refused, stating that medical triage did not recognize rank, only severity. The officer threatened to report him for insubordination. Lieutenant Morrison, the white nurse, intervened. She supported Adams' decision and told the officer to wait his turn. The officer left in anger, promising consequences. Adams continued working as if nothing had happened, but Shizuko saw the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in his movements. He had risked punishment to maintain his professional ethics. Even in the military, even in uniform, his authority was questioned because of his skin color. That evening, Private Thompson appeared with news. The officer had filed a complaint. Adams would face a disciplinary hearing. Thompson was angry, his usual gentle demeanor replaced by barely contained fury. He paced the hospital supply room, speaking rapidly in English. Fumiko, present to help with a new patient, translated the key points. Adams had saved dozens of soldiers. He worked longer hours than any other medic. He treated everyone equally. And he was being punished for it. Shizuko listened and felt her worldview shifting again. These men faced injustice from their own people. They endured racism from the soldiers they served alongside. Yet they still showed kindness to enemy prisoners. The strength required for that kindness suddenly seemed immense. Superhuman. On October 8th, Shizuko saw Sergeant Johnson again. She was returning to the barracks after her shift when she noticed him outside the administrative building. He was arguing with a white captain, their voices raised. She could not understand the words, but the body language was clear. Johnson stood at attention while the captain gestured angrily. Other soldiers passed by, carefully avoiding eye contact. No one intervened. When Johnson finally walked away, his face was carved from stone. He passed within 10 feet of Shizuko without seeing her. She watched him disappear toward the enlisted barracks and felt an unexpected emotion. Not fear, not hatred. Something closer to recognition. He carried the same tension Adams had shown, the same careful control, the same exhaustion that came from constantly defending one's dignity. That night, Shizuko lay awake thinking about the men who guarded her. They were not the monsters from propaganda, but they were also not the simple heroes she might have imagined. They were human, complicated, carrying their own wounds that had nothing to do with combat. The realization did not erase her fear of Johnson, but it added dimension to it, context she had never considered. October 10th through October 16th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The disciplinary hearing cleared Corporal Adams of any wrongdoing. Lieutenant Morrison's testimony proved decisive. The white officer who filed the complaint was quietly transferred to another facility. Adams returned to work without comment, but something had changed. He was quieter, more careful. The easy warmth he had shown before was replaced by professional distance. Shizuko missed his previous kindness and hated herself for it. What right did she have to expect warmth from a man who had just been punished for doing his job correctly? Yet she found herself working harder to earn his approval. She memorized medication names. She learned to anticipate what he needed before he asked. She proved herself useful, because being useful felt like the only value she possessed. Private Thompson noticed her increased effort during one of his visits. He brought her a chocolate bar from the canteen, a rare treat that prisoners could not normally afford. She tried to refuse, but he insisted through gestures and broken English. A gift between friends, not soldier to prisoner. The chocolate was sweeter than anything she had tasted in years. It made her want to cry. The small kindnesses accumulated despite her resistance. Another soldier named Jackson brought her a pair of warm socks when he noticed her shivering during a cold morning. A white sergeant named Murphy taught her how to say medical terms correctly, patiently correcting her pronunciation without mockery. These men had no reason to be kind. They chose it anyway. On October 14th, Shizuko encountered another Japanese woman in the hospital. Her name was Naoko Matsumoto. She had been transferred from a camp in California after attempting escape. The punishment was a broken rib from the guards who recaptured her. She lay in the recovery ward, her face swollen and discolored. Shizuko brought her water and rice. Naoko ate slowly, each movement clearly painful. She was older than Shizuko, perhaps 30, with hard eyes that had seen too much. She asked Shizuko direct questions in Japanese, ignoring the listening soldiers who could not understand. How long had she been at McCoy? Had anyone hurt her? Had she learned not to trust the black soldiers? The final question hung in the air. Shizuko hesitated, then shook her head. Some of the black soldiers had been kind. Naoko laughed bitterly. The sound was ugly in the quiet hospital. She told Shizuko about California, about the sergeant who had befriended her, about the night he cornered her in the laundry, about fighting him off and being punished for assaulting a guard, about learning that kindness was a tool predators used. Shizuko felt ice form in her stomach. She asked if the sergeant had been black. Naoko nodded. She described him: tall, broad shoulders, a scar along his jawline. The description could fit thousands of men, but something in Naoko's voice suggested she was describing someone specific, someone she expected Shizuko to recognize. That evening, Shizuko watched Sergeant Johnson during his inspection of the compound. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and along his left jaw, barely visible in the fading light, ran a thin white scar. The same scar Naoko had described. The same man who had threatened her that first week. The same man who now ignored her existence. Shizuko felt her carefully constructed understanding collapse. The kindness of Thompson and Adams meant nothing if Johnson was everything Naoko claimed. One predator could hide among dozens of decent men. One threat could undo all the small gestures of humanity. She had been a fool to let her guard down. October 17th through October 23rd, 1945, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Shizuko avoided Naoko for 3 days after their conversation. She could not face the other woman's knowing eyes or bitter certainty. But the hospital was small. Eventually, they had to speak again. Naoko was recovering quickly. Her ribs were healing. The swelling in her face had subsided. She would be released back to general population within the week. The prospect seemed to depress her more than the injury had. At least in the hospital, she was protected. Outside, she would be vulnerable again. On October 19th, during a quiet afternoon, Naoko asked Shizuko to help her walk to the latrine. Once they were alone, Naoko spoke rapidly in Japanese. She wanted Shizuko to understand something important. Not all the soldiers were bad. Most were decent men doing difficult work. But the decent ones could not always protect prisoners from the bad ones. Military hierarchy protected sergeants over prisoners, American soldiers over enemy civilians. Shizuko listened carefully. She asked the question she had been avoiding. Was Naoko certain it was Johnson who attacked her in California? Naoko paused, then admitted she was not completely sure. The laundry had been dark. She had been terrified. The man had been black and wore sergeant stripes. She had seen a scar. But California had many camps and many black sergeants. Perhaps she was wrong about the specific man. Perhaps she was right. The uncertainty made it worse. This admission changed everything. Naoko's certainty had been terrifying but simple. Her uncertainty was more complex and more honest. Maybe Johnson had attacked someone in California. Maybe he had not. Maybe his threat to Shizuko had been serious. Maybe it had been something else entirely. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. Corporal Adams found Shizuko crying in the supply room that evening. He did not ask why. He simply sat beside her and offered a handkerchief. They sat in silence for 10 minutes. Finally, Adams spoke in his careful, slow English. He told her something Fumiko had once translated: that war broke people in ways that did not always heal, that fear could make monsters out of normal people, that forgiveness did not mean forgetting or excusing. It meant choosing not to let the past poison the future. Shizuko did not fully understand all his words, but she understood his meaning. Adams knew she was afraid. He knew why. He was not telling her to ignore her fear. He was telling her that fear could either protect her or imprison her. The choice was hers. On October 22nd, Private Thompson brought Shizuko a letter. It had been forwarded through the Red Cross. Her mother was alive. She had survived the war and was living in Nagasaki with relatives. She wrote that she prayed for Shizuko daily, that she hoped America was treating her daughter well, that she looked forward to their reunion when the war finally released its grip on their family. Shizuko clutched the letter and wept. Thompson looked alarmed, unsure if he had done something wrong. Adams explained that these were good tears, relief tears. Thompson relaxed and smiled. He said something in English that Adams translated. Thompson was glad she had family waiting for her. Everyone needed people who loved them, especially during war. The letter transformed everything. Shizuko had been drifting, unmoored from past and future. Now she had a destination, a reason to endure. Her mother was alive. Japan still existed beyond the propaganda and destruction. There was something to survive for. That night, Shizuko looked at Sergeant Johnson with different eyes during his evening inspection. He was not a symbol, not a threat divorced from humanity. He was a man. Possibly a dangerous man. Possibly a damaged man. Possibly both. She could not know his truth, but she could choose how to respond to her uncertainty. October 24th through October 30th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Naoko was released from the hospital on October 24th. Before she left, she pulled Shizuko aside for a final conversation. She wanted to apologize. Her warnings had been based on her own experience and fear. She should not have projected them onto Shizuko's situation. Every camp was different. Every soldier was different. Shizuko should trust her own judgment, not Naoko's trauma. The apology lifted weight Shizuko had not realized she was carrying. She thanked Naoko and wished her well. The older woman smiled sadly and said something that would haunt Shizuko for days. In war, everyone becomes a prisoner. Some are just locked in different kinds of cages. On October 27th, an incident occurred that tested everything Shizuko had learned. A young Japanese man named Kenji was caught stealing food from the mess hall. He was 19 years old, barely more than a boy. He had been hungry. The theft was minor, but the punishment was severe. 10 days in the isolation cells on reduced rations. The Japanese prisoners were outraged. 10 days in isolation for a few extra pieces of bread seemed cruel and disproportionate. Some of the men talked about organized protest, about refusing to work, about demanding better treatment. The situation escalated quickly. Sergeant Johnson was put in charge of transferring Kenji to isolation. Shizuko watched from across the compound as Johnson and 2 other soldiers escorted the young man toward the detention building. Kenji was crying, begging in Japanese. Johnson's face was stone. He did not respond to the pleading. Then something unexpected happened. Halfway to the detention building, Johnson stopped. He spoke to the other soldiers. They seemed surprised but followed his orders. Johnson took Kenji alone into the administrative building instead of the isolation cells. They were inside for 20 minutes. When they emerged, Kenji was no longer crying. Johnson walked him to isolation but stopped at the door. He said something to Kenji in broken Japanese. 3 words that Shizuko heard clearly from her position near the hospital. Not bad person. Then he opened the door, and Kenji walked inside without resistance. The other Japanese prisoners who witnessed this were confused. What had Johnson said inside the administrative building? Why had Kenji's attitude changed so completely? Fumiko, who had contacts among the Japanese work crews, learned the truth that evening. Johnson had not taken Kenji to see the camp commander. He had taken him to the chapel. Inside the chapel, Johnson had explained something to Kenji through gestures and the few Japanese words he knew. That isolation was mandatory for theft, that he could not change the rules, but that he could ensure Kenji's safety during those 10 days, that he would personally check on him daily, that the reduced rations would still be adequate, that this punishment was not meant to break him, just to maintain order. More remarkably, Johnson had revealed something personal. He told Kenji that he had been punished unjustly many times in his life, for being black in places that hated black people, for demanding respect in a system designed to deny it. He understood what it meant to be punished for simply trying to survive. He would make sure Kenji's punishment was fair, even if he could not prevent it entirely. This story spread through the Japanese prisoner population like wildfire. Sergeant Johnson, the man they had been taught to fear, had shown unexpected mercy. He had used his power to ease suffering rather than increase it. The prisoners debated what this meant. Some dismissed it as a calculated move to prevent protest. Others saw it as genuine compassion. Shizuko understood it as something more complex. Johnson was not simply kind or cruel. He was a man trying to do his job in a system that limited his choices. He enforced rules he might not agree with. He showed mercy where he could. He carried his own wounds while managing the wounds of others. On October 30th, Shizuko finally encountered Johnson directly for the first time since that night in the mess hall. She was walking from the hospital to the barracks when he appeared from around a building. They nearly collided. Both stopped abruptly. Johnson looked at her for a long moment. His face showed surprise, then something else. Recognition. Maybe regret. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it. Finally, he simply nodded and stepped aside to let her pass. Shizuko walked by, her heart pounding. But for the first time, fear was not the only emotion she felt. November 1st through November 7th, 1945. Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The encounter outside the hospital changed something fundamental. Johnson began appearing more frequently in places Shizuko worked, not threatening, not speaking, simply present, as if he was working up courage to say something he had been avoiding. Corporal Adams noticed and asked Fumiko to translate a warning. If Johnson was making Shizuko uncomfortable, she should report it immediately. Adams would ensure it was handled properly. But Shizuko found herself shaking her head. Johnson was not making her uncomfortable. He was making her curious. On November 3rd, Private Thompson mentioned something surprising during his daily visit to the hospital. He was friends with Johnson. They had served together in Europe before being transferred to camp duty. Thompson said Johnson was a complicated man who had seen terrible things during the war, that he struggled with anger and bitterness about how black soldiers were treated, that he sometimes pushed people away before they could reject him, that underneath the hard exterior was someone deeply wounded by years of fighting for a country that did not fully accept him. Thompson's words echoed in Shizuko's mind. She had never considered that Johnson might be pushing her away deliberately, that his threat might have been a test or a defense mechanism, that his subsequent indifference might be shame rather than contempt. The possibility reframed everything. On November 5th, the moment finally came. Shizuko was working late in the hospital, sterilizing instruments after a busy day. She thought she was alone. Then she heard boots on the concrete floor. She turned and found Sergeant Johnson standing in the doorway. He looked uncertain, an expression that seemed wrong on his usually confident face. He spoke in English. She understood only fragments, but his tone carried weight. Apology. Regret. He stepped closer and tried again, slower this time. He said 3 words she recognized. "I am sorry." Then he continued in English that she could not follow. He seemed frustrated by the language barrier. Shizuko made a decision. She went to find Fumiko. The older woman was in the barracks, but she returned with Shizuko despite the late hour. When they entered the hospital, Johnson was still there, waiting. He looked relieved when he saw Fumiko. Through Fumiko's translation, Johnson finally explained. He had threatened Shizuko that first night because he was angry, not at her specifically, but at everything she represented. He had just received news that his brother had been killed in the Pacific by Japanese forces. He had been grieving and furious. When he saw Shizuko, he saw the enemy who had killed his brother. He wanted to hurt her the way he was hurting. But he had not touched her. He had walked away because he realized she was not his enemy. She was a prisoner, a civilian, a woman far from home who was just as afraid as he had been during the war. He had spent weeks feeling ashamed of his behavior. He wanted her to know that she was safe, that he would never harm her, that his words that night did not represent who he wanted to be. Shizuko listened through Fumiko's careful translation. When Johnson finished, she asked Fumiko to translate her response. She told him that she understood grief, that she had lost family too, that war had poisoned everyone with fear and hatred. She admitted she had been terrified of him for weeks, that the propaganda had taught her to expect cruelty from black soldiers, that his kindness to Kenji had confused her more than his threat had frightened her. Johnson listened and nodded slowly. He asked, through Fumiko, if she could forgive him. Shizuko considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was not simple. Trust had to be rebuilt slowly. But she could acknowledge his humanity. She could recognize that he was trying to be better than his worst moment. She told him yes, she could forgive. But more importantly, she could see him as a person now, not a symbol, not a threat. Just a man trying to survive his own war. Johnson's relief was visible. He thanked her and turned to leave. Then he stopped and added something else through Fumiko's translation. He said that many black soldiers joined the military, hoping to prove they deserved equal rights. They fought for a country that segregated them. They wore uniforms that were supposed to represent freedom while experiencing discrimination daily. The war had taught him that everyone was fighting multiple battles, the one on the battlefield and the ones inside themselves. After he left, Shizuko sat in the empty hospital for a long time. Fumiko stayed with her, not speaking. Finally, Shizuko said something she had been thinking for weeks, that everyone in the camp was a prisoner in some way. The Japanese were prisoners of war. The black soldiers were prisoners of a system that valued them less than white soldiers. Everyone was trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Freedom would require more than just ending the war. November 8, 1945 through March 15, 1946, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The conversation with Sergeant Johnson changed everything for Shizuko. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like ice melting in spring. Her fear transformed into something more complex: understanding, compassion, recognition that everyone carried wounds from the war. She continued working in the hospital through the winter. Corporal Adams taught her more advanced medical procedures. Private Thompson visited regularly, bringing news from outside the camp. The war in the Pacific had ended in August. Japan had surrendered after 2 atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world was trying to rebuild from ashes. Sergeant Johnson kept his distance but remained visible. He nodded when they passed in the compound. He asked Adams about her progress. He never again approached her directly. The space between them was no longer filled with threat. It held something quieter: mutual respect earned through honesty. In December, Shizuko learned she would be repatriated in spring. The Red Cross was organizing transportation for civilian prisoners who posed no security risk. She would return to Japan to find her mother in Nagasaki. The news brought joy mixed with complicated grief. She had survived. But she was returning to a country destroyed by the very war that had brought her to America. On her last day at Camp McCoy, March 14, 1946, the hospital staff held a small gathering. Adams gave her a medical kit with bandages and basic supplies. Lieutenant Morrison contributed English medical textbooks. Thompson brought a small American flag and told her through Fumiko that America was not perfect, but it was trying to be better. Keep it to remember that change was possible. Sergeant Johnson appeared at the end of the gathering. He handed her a sealed envelope and asked Fumiko to translate. Inside was a letter written in careful English with a Japanese translation attached. The letter explained that he had asked a Japanese-American soldier to translate his words. He wanted her to understand completely. The letter was simple. He thanked her for forgiving him. He said that meeting her had taught him something important: that enemies were often just people who had never been given the chance to know each other. That hatred required distance and ignorance to survive. That proximity and honesty could transform even the deepest prejudice. He hoped she would find peace in Japan. He hoped he would find peace in America. He hoped they both would remember that change was always possible. Shizuko read the letter 3 times. Then she wrote her own response through Fumiko's careful translation. She told him that she had been raised to hate Americans, especially Black Americans. That propaganda had painted them as monsters. That meeting him and the others had shown her that propaganda only worked when people remained strangers. She thanked him for his apology. She thanked him more for his honesty. She wished him a life free from the prejudice he had endured. March 15, 1946, San Francisco, California. Shizuko boarded a ship bound for Japan with 300 other repatriated civilians. She stood at the rail watching America disappear into the horizon. The country had been her prison, but it had also been her teacher. She carried lessons that would shape the rest of her life. 1953, Nagasaki, Japan. Shizuko had spent 7 years working as a nurse in a hospital serving atomic bomb survivors. She had found her mother alive, but forever changed by radiation sickness. She had married a doctor who shared her commitment to healing. She had 2 children who would never know war. She also spoke publicly about her experience in America. She told community groups about the Black soldiers who had shown her unexpected kindness. She challenged the lingering propaganda about American brutality. She argued that peace required more than ending fighting. It required ending the hatred that made fighting possible. In October of 1953, she received a letter from America. The return address said, Sergeant Henry Johnson, now living in Chicago, Illinois. He had tracked her down through Red Cross records. His letter described his life after the war. He had returned to segregated America and found that fighting for his country had not earned him equality. He had joined the civil rights movement. He was fighting a different war now, a war for dignity and recognition. He wrote that he often thought about their conversation in the hospital, that her forgiveness had given him hope that change was possible, that if a Japanese woman could forgive a Black American soldier for threatening her, then maybe America could learn to see Black citizens as fully human. Her compassion had sustained him through difficult years of activism and disappointment. Shizuko wrote back immediately. She told him about her work in Nagasaki, about teaching her children that former enemies could become friends, about using her experience to argue for reconciliation between Japan and America. She thanked him for the lesson he had taught her, that everyone was fighting multiple wars, the visible ones and the internal ones, that victory required winning both. They continued corresponding for decades. Two people who had started as enemies bound by war. Two people who had discovered their shared humanity in a Wisconsin prison camp. Two people who spent the rest of their lives teaching others that hatred was learned and could be unlearned. That forgiveness was not weakness, but the hardest kind of strength. That the bonds formed between former enemies could be stronger than the bonds between friends who had never been tested. In her final letter, written in 1987, shortly before her death, Shizuko wrote something that captured the entire journey. She said that the war had taught her to hate, but peace had taught her to love. The difference was not in the people she encountered, but in her willingness to see them as human. Sergeant Johnson had frightened her, but he had also freed her. From fear, from prejudice, from the prison of propaganda. She thanked him for that gift, the gift of transformation, the gift of hope, the gift of understanding that mercy could triumph over hatred if people were brave enough to choose it. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.